On a gray October morning in 1978, a maid entered room 100 of New York's Chelsea Hotel expecting chaos, but not death. What she found was Nancy Spungen, 20 years old, lying half-naked on the bathroom floor. Her skin was pale, her blonde hair matted with blood, a single stab wound just below the abdomen. Her boyfriend, 21-year-old Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols, was asleep in the bed, his hands trembling, a knife somewhere in the sheets. This was supposed to be the couple who embodied punk rebellion, raw, loud, and fearless. Instead, their story would become a modern tragedy of addiction, obsession, and self-destruction. Before the blood and headlines, there was the myth. Sid Vicious was born John Simon Ritchie in London, 1957. His childhood was fractured, an absent father, a mother dependent on drugs, and long stretches of neglect that hardened him before he turned 10. He was the kind of boy society ignored until he made too much noise to be ignored. By the mid-1970s, London streets pulsed with discontent. Unemployment, class rage, and youthful nihilism birthed punk rock, a movement that sneered at everything polite society held sacred. Sid found his identity there. He was a virtuoso musician, but he was a symbol, tall, gaunt, and radiating danger. When Malcolm McLaren replaced the Sex Pistols' bassist Glenn Matlock in 1977, Sid's sneer became the band's new face. Nancy Spungen was the opposite kind of chaos, American privilege, but unstable from childhood. Born in Philadelphia in 1958, she was diagnosed early with severe emotional disorders. Her parents tried hospitals and therapy. Nancy turned instead to rebellion. By 16, she'd been expelled from multiple schools. By 17, she was living in New York's underground scene. And by 18, she had moved to London chasing the very bands that defined punk's raw heart. When she met Sid, two volatile worlds collided. Friends remember the night they met as electric. Nancy was already notorious among groupies, demanding, blunt, and unafraid. Sid was intoxicated by her. Within weeks, they were inseparable. She became his anchor and his poison, introducing him to heroin and feeding his image as punk's dark prince. In public, they were loud and inseparable. In private, their love teetered between devotion and destruction. The Sex Pistols were imploding under fame, drugs, and internal conflict. Their final U.S. tour in early 1978 ended in chaos. Sid collapsed during shows, Johnny Rotten quit mid-tour, and McLaren declared the band dead. Sid and Nancy returned to New York, retreating into the Chelsea Hotel, a decaying sanctuary for artists, addicts, and dreamers, once home to writers like Dylan Thomas and musicians like Bob Dylan. By the late 70s, it had become a vertical wasteland of lost souls. The couple moved into room 100, paying $11 a night. Neighbors described hearing fights, crashes, and crying through the walls. Some said Nancy acted like Sid's manager, calling clubs, arranging small gigs, trying to resurrect his solo career. Others saw something darker, an enabler feeding his addiction while drowning in her own. Police records and witness statements later painted a grim picture. Sid's heroin use spiraled. He'd pawn Nancy's belongings for drugs, then beg her forgiveness. She'd scream, throw things, and then curl up beside him again. By September 1978, Sid's overdoses were frequent. He'd been hospitalized multiple times. One nurse noted that Nancy visited every day, bringing drugs hidden in her purse. Still, there were glimpses of tenderness. Friends recalled Sid saying, "She's the only one who understands me." To Nancy, he wasn't Sid Vicious. He was John, the frightened boy who never fit in. But even love cannot survive when addiction becomes a language of connection. In the early hours of October 12th, the final chapter began. According to hotel staff, Sid and Nancy had been arguing all night. The room reeked of alcohol and heroin smoke. Around 2:30 a.m., guests in adjacent rooms heard screaming and something heavy hitting the wall. Then silence. At roughly 10 a.m., housekeeper Betty Benedict unlocked the door. Sid lay half-conscious on the bed, his body covered with track marks. Nancy was on the bathroom floor, a knife wound in her abdomen, blood pooling beneath her. The 5-inch blade matched one Sid had recently bought from a street vendor. When police arrived, Sid's only words were, "I killed her. I can't live without her." He was arrested immediately for second-degree murder. But from the beginning, nothing about the case was clear. Sid's confession was inconsistent. He later told detectives he had no memory of the night, claiming he woke up to find Nancy dead beside him, in his pockets. Police found a small amount of heroin, drug paraphernalia, and $14 in cash. Nancy's time of death was estimated between 3 o'clock and 6 a.m. The stab wound was deep but oddly placed, suggesting either a wild struggle or a confused attempt at self-harm. As news spread, the world reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination. To some, it was Punk's inevitable end, its two most infamous lovers consumed by the chaos they preached. To others, it was a tragedy born of youth, addiction, and a city that swallowed the broken. The tabloids called it the Sid and Nancy murder mystery. But behind the headlines, investigators faced more questions than answers. How did a couple so publicly self-destructive manage to hide this level of violence in plain sight? Was it murder, or an accident in the middle of a drug-fueled nightmare? And if Sid didn't kill Nancy, who did? That question would haunt detectives, friends, and fans for decades. From the moment police carried Sid Vicious out of room 100, the line between truth and myth began to blur. Outside the Chelsea Hotel, reporters crowded the entrance, shouting questions he couldn't answer. Cameras flashed as he was shoved into the back of a patrol car, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He looked less like a murderer and more like a man already halfway gone. At the precinct, Sid was barely conscious. Officers described him as trembling, incoherent, repeatedly muttering Nancy's name. His blood tests later revealed high levels of barbiturates and opiates, so much that detectives postponed his formal questioning for several hours. When he finally spoke, his story shifted. He claimed he and Nancy had been fighting. She wanted money. He said he didn't have any left. He told police she had been so depressed and talking about ending it. Then he paused. Maybe she did it, he whispered. Maybe she fell on the knife. It wasn't much of a defense, but it was the beginning of one. The knife, an ordinary hunting blade, was dusted for prints, but none were clearly usable. Blood patterns showed Nancy had been stabbed once while standing, then collapsed. No defensive wounds, no signs of multiple strikes. Some investigators quietly wondered if Sid had been too incapacitated to attack her at all. The autopsy confirmed the wound was fatal, but strangely positioned below the navel, not the chest. A single deep thrust. The medical examiner noted that it could have been self-inflicted, though it was unlikely. Toxicology revealed high levels of barbiturates in Nancy's blood as well. In the chaos of the investigation, witnesses from the hotel began surfacing. One resident, artist Patrick Jeffrey, told police he had seen several people going in and out of Sid's room that night. Another, photographer Eileen Polk, claimed drug dealers were known to visit the couple frequently, often stealing cash or drugs while they were passed out. The Chelsea Hotel was notorious for this, rooms full of addicts, dealers, artists, and fugitives all blending together under the same decaying ceiling. Security was minimal. People came and went at all hours. That uncertainty gave rise to theories. One rumor claimed Nancy was killed during a botched robbery, that someone had come to the room to sell drugs, realized the couple had cash, and attacked her. Another theory said Nancy stabbed herself during a fight, desperate to get Sid's attention. But to the NYPD, none of it mattered. Sid's confession, however confused, was enough. He was charged with second-degree murder and taken to Rikers Island to await trial. There, behind bars, Sid Vicious became both legend and ghost. His lawyer, Jim Merberg, told reporters that Sid was in shock and deeply remorseful. In private, he described his client as a child trapped in a nightmare he can't wake from. Despite the murder charge, Sid's notoriety only grew. The punk scene, fragmented after the Sex Pistols breakup, now had a martyr figure to rally around. Some fans mailed him letters of support, calling Nancy's death a symbol of the system's failure to understand punk. Others saw it differently. Johnny Rotten, Sid's former bandmate, said later, Nancy was bad for him. They fed off each other's sickness. It was never going to end well. The press turned the case into a grim circus. Every headline screamed, "Punk kills girlfriend." Newspapers ran photos of Sid sneering, bloodshot eyes glaring behind his leather jacket. as if the archetype of rebellion had finally destroyed itself. But beneath the spectacle, the human story was far darker. Letters Nancy had written to her mother were found in her belongings. In one, dated just weeks before her death, she wrote, "Sid says he wants to get clean, but I don't know if we can. It feels like the drugs on us now." Sid's mother, Ann Beverly, was frantic. She had once been part of the London drug scene herself and understood the gravity of her son's addiction. She flew to New York, visiting him at Rikers almost daily, pleaded with the court for bail so he could enter rehab. On February 1st, 1979, nearly 4 months after Nancy's death, the court finally granted Sid bail. His bond was set at $50,000, paid by Virgin Records and Malcolm McLaren, the Sex Pistols' former manager. Sid walked out of Rikers pale, thin and shaken. Outside, reporters shouted his name, but he kept his eyes down, gripping his mother's hand. He told one journalist quietly, "I just want to go home." But home no longer existed. He and Nancy had destroyed every version of normal life long before she died. And without her, Sid was drifting, free from prison but trapped in grief, guilt, and withdrawal. He moved into a small apartment with his mother in Greenwich Village and tried to stay clean. Friends said he seemed almost childlike, talking about starting over, playing music again, even getting a job. His lawyer arranged interviews and promised to fight the case, arguing that the evidence was too weak for conviction. For a brief moment, it looked as though Sid Vicious might survive his own legend. But heroin doesn't forget. Within days, Sid was using again. He began seeing Michelle Robinson, a new girlfriend who was also deep in the punk scene. She later told police that Sid would talk about Nancy constantly, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, often say he wanted to join her. On the night of February 1st, 1979, the exact anniversary of his release, Sid attended a small party at a friend's apartment on Bank Street. It was meant to celebrate his newfound freedom, a chance to start again. Someone brought heroin. Witnesses said Sid seemed nervous but calm. Around midnight, he injected himself and collapsed shortly after. His mother found him the next morning, blue and motionless. He was 21. Next to his body was a note. It read, "We had a death pact, and I have to keep my half of the bargain. Please bury me next to my baby. Bury me next to Nancy." There was no signature. Sid Vicious, the boy who became punk's icon of chaos, had fulfilled his own prophecy. When the news broke on February 2nd, 1979, headlines around the world screamed, "Sid Vicious dead of overdose." To the public, it felt like the inevitable final act of punk's tragedy, a young man consumed by the chaos he once celebrated. But to those who knew him and Nancy, it didn't bring closure. It deepened the mystery. Nancy's mother, Deborah Spungen, was in Philadelphia when she heard. She had buried her daughter just 4 months earlier, under the unbearable weight of public scrutiny. Now, the boy accused of killing her daughter was gone, too. In her 1983 memoir, "And I Don't Want to Live This Life," she wrote, "When Sid died, I didn't feel justice. I felt emptiness. My daughter was gone, and now so was the only person who might have told us what really happened." With Sid's death, the murder case against him was legally closed. No trial, no verdict, no chance of the truth to unfold under oath. Police archived the evidence. The knife, the autopsy photos, the witness statements. Over time, files disappeared, witnesses scattered, and the story twisted into myth. But some people refused to let it die quietly. Detective James Dever, one of the original officers at the scene, later admitted that the investigation had been chaotic from the start. "It was a circus," he said in a 1990 interview. Half the building was high. The other half was giving statements that didn't match. We couldn't even keep track of who was in that room. According to hotel residents, several people had been in and out of room 100 the night Nancy died. Among them were known drug dealers, one of whom, Rockets Regler, was a roadie and actor who openly bragged years later about being there that night. He denied killing Nancy, claiming he'd only gone to deliver drugs. But in punk circles, whispers persisted that Nancy had been stabbed during a robbery while Sid lay unconscious. Sid's mother, Ann Beverly, believed that version until her own death. She told the British press in the early 1990s, "My son was too far gone to have done it. He couldn't even stand up that night. They robbed him. They killed her. No solid evidence ever confirmed that theory." But given the chaos of the Chelsea Hotel and the flood of drugs involved, many investigators privately conceded that it was possible. The tragedy became more than a murder mystery. It became a symbol. The relationship between Sid and Nancy was dissected by journalists, sociologists, and fans for decades. Some called it a cautionary tale of codependence and addiction. Others, disturbingly, romanticized punk Romeo and Juliet. Movies, songs, and books followed. In 1986, Alex Cox's film Sid and Nancy, starring Gary Oldman and Chloe Webb, turned the doomed couple into pop culture icons. The film portrayed their love as destructive but passionate. Two lost souls devoured by the world they helped create. Critics loved it. Nancy's family hated it. Deborah Spungen called it a glamorization of murder. By the late 1980s, the story had drifted so far from reality that few remembered the human cost. The Chelsea Hotel, once a crime scene, became a tourist destination for punk pilgrims. Room 100 was eventually remodeled and renumbered, but visitors still whisper about the blood on the bathroom tiles that never fully washed away. What remained after the noise faded were two broken families. Sid's mother returned to London carrying her son's ashes in an urn. She kept them for 20 years. In 1996, when she learned the Chelsea Hotel was still standing, she made one final trip to New York. According to a friend who accompanied her, she took a handful of Sid's ashes to the park behind the hotel and quietly scattered them where Nancy's blood had once been. "He wanted to be with her," she said. "Now he is." That gesture divided opinion. Some called it fitting. Two lovers reunited in death. Others saw it as a tragic repetition of the same blindness that doomed them both. In the years that followed, the case of Nancy Spungen's death faded from the headlines, but not from the public imagination. True crime authors revisited it, musicians referenced it, and generations of fans argued over what really happened that night in Room 100. The evidence, such as it was, remained ambiguous. The autopsy report noted no signs of defensive wounds, no multiple stab marks. The blood trail suggested a single wound delivered at close range. The lack of force and placement below the stomach led some forensic experts to theorize that Nancy may have stabbed herself in a moment of intoxicated despair. Her own friends rejected that idea. They insisted Nancy wanted to live, that she had been trying to get Sid clean and restart his music career. One friend, photographer Eileen Polk, told Rolling Stone, "They were out of control, but Nancy wasn't suicidal. She was scared. I think someone else came into that room." But without a trial, there would never be answers. Only fragments. Confessions muttered through a haze of drugs, police notes smudged by time, and photographs that captured more myth than truth. And through it all, the legend of Sid and Nancy hardened into a warning. How fame, addiction, and love can twist into something unrecognizable until both people disappear beneath the weight of their own creation. Time softens everything, except the kind of pain that never really ends. For the families of Sid Vicious and Nancy Spungen, the years that followed were not about healing. They were about surviving what was left. Nancy's mother, Deborah, spent the next decade turning her grief into advocacy. She wrote, spoke publicly, and pushed for awareness around domestic abuse and youth mental illness. In interviews, she often reminded people that Nancy was more than a crime headline. She was a daughter who struggled from childhood with pain no one understood. "People forget she was a person," Deborah said in a 1983 television interview. "They made her into a villain because it was easier than facing what really happened." Her book, And I Don't Want to Live This Life, became both a memoir and a warning, a plea for parents not to ignore the signs of addiction and emotional instability. Through her words, Nancy's life was reframed, not as a cautionary fable about rebellion, but as a story about a young woman who wanted to be loved and found it in someone who was too broken to give it back. Sid's legacy, however, became something far more complicated. To some, he remained punk's fallen angel, a symbol of pure rebellion, unpolished truth, and destruction as art. To others, he was the embodiment of everything the movement had lost, authenticity devoured by addiction, rage mistaken for freedom. Malcolm McLaren, the Sex Pistols' former manager, once said, "Sid's death was a final act of punk. It began as a protest against control and ended in complete chaos." That was the statement. But in quieter corners of memory, those who knew Sid as John Ritchie remembered something different. A frightened boy who never learned how to be safe, who mistook pain for purpose. His mother, and once described him not as a monster, but as a casualty of fame. He was a little boy lost. The world saw Sid Vicious, but I lost John. In the decades since, countless documentaries, books, and retrospectives have tried to explain what happened in Room 100, but no version satisfies. Each retelling adds another layer of myth, another guess, another headline. And perhaps that's because Sid and Nancy's story was never about clarity. It was about the slow disintegration of two young people caught between fame and oblivion. In a way, they represented the very era they came from, one defined by rebellion, self-destruction, an illusion that chaos could somehow be pure. The Chelsea Hotel still stands on West 23rd Street. Renovated now, quieter, its walls still hold echoes of the past. Writers, artists, musicians, and ghosts. Tour guides no longer mention Room 100 by number. It has been repainted, renumbered, and reimagined. But those who know the story say the silence in that corridor feels heavier than in any other. Sometimes, late at night, guests have claimed to hear faint music from somewhere behind the walls. A bass line, distant, uneven. Maybe it's the plumbing. Or maybe, in the mythology of punk, it's Sid, forever trying to tune his bass one last time. Nancy lies in King David Memorial Park in Philadelphia. Her grave is simple. Her name, her dates, and a small engraving of a dove. Fans still visit, leaving flowers, bracelets, and sometimes notes that read, "You were misunderstood." There's no grave for Sid beside her, but in 1996, part of his ashes were scattered near her tombstone, honoring the promise he made in his final note. Two lost souls, forever linked by love, addiction, and the legend they never meant to create. When asked years later how she wanted people to remember them, Deborah Spungen answered quietly, "As human, they were just kids. They weren't monsters. They just didn't make it out." And maybe that's a truth buried under every version of their story. Not punk's tragedy, not a sensational murder, but two broken people who loved each other too hard, too young, and too recklessly. The Chelsea Hotel became their stage, and the world their audience. When the lights went out, only silence remained. The final police report closed with a single line that never reached the headlines. Case remains unresolved due to death of the primary suspect. But for those who still whisper their names, Sid and Nancy's story never really ended. It lingers in the music, in the myths, in the reminder that behind every rebellion lies a very human need to be seen, to be loved, to be remembered,